Okay, with State of Origin in the NRL coming up, literally in a few days, Game 1 of the 2022 State of Origin series coming up, and it being a big talking point in Australian sport right now, I want to revisit a topic that I spoke about 4 years ago, when City Country, the first season without City Country Origin. Because in 2017 was the last time we saw City Country played. I believe it was in Mudgee. And I think it was Paul Gallen's last rep game as well. And at the time, Todd Greenburg wanted to move the NRL into a different commercial direction. Now, we have seen games taken on the road to, regional New South Wales and regional Queensland for a variety of reasons. COVID has also had an impact on that. We also see it with State of Origin when they take that neutral game to Perth, Adelaide or Melbourne. So the NRL is not averse to taking games to rural New South Wales and sometimes regional and rural Queensland. But they said at the time, City Origin had lost its purpose in the game. That because it was no longer used as a selection game for the New South Wales Blues, it had lost its importance. And that there were other ways to invest in and grow the game in rural and regional locations across Australia, not just New South Wales and Queensland, because obviously they take State of Origin and regular season games on the road to places like Perth, Darwin, Adelaide, and sometimes to Melbourne as well, and pre-season games, which we've seen, which is not a bad thing. But I do think the Origin period has lost something. And the NRL didn't rule out bringing back City Country Origin in some format in the future. Now, Todd Greenburg, since that decision was made in 2017, and since I did the video in 2018, is gone. Within 2 years of me making that video, he had resigned or was sacked, depending which way you look at it, by Peter V'Landys, who is the Australian Rugby League Commissioner Chairman, and Andrew Abdo replaced him first on an interim, now on a permanent basis. So the leadership of the NRL is different now to what it was when the decision was made. And obviously when the decision was made, COVID wasn't a thing, and the TV deal was actually due for negotiation this year in 2022 at the end of this season. Of course, circumstances with COVID and the pandemic sped up that process in 2020, so the TV deal was renegotiated before the return to play. That is very, very important. Now, also what's been put on the table is expansion. So now we've got the Red Cliff Dolphins joining for next season, who are in suburban Brisbane. They join the competition to make it 17 teams, and of course there's the question of where the 18th team goes. So there's a lot of things on the NRL's in-tray at the moment, in the in-tray, for Andrew Abdo and Peter V'Landys, and there's been a lot of criticism of some of the rule changes. Has it been good or bad for the game? I think it sped up the game and made the game different, but not all the rule changes have worked. So there's a lot of things in the NRL's in-tray, but they didn't rule out bringing back City Country Origin at some point. Now, I'm a massive fan of the Origin period. I'm a massive fan of the rep rounds, as they used to be, like the Anzac Day test between Australia and New Zealand. And what we have this year is the Pacific Islands test double header during, I think, Origin 2, which says to me it's a perfect time, midway through the season, to actually have a mid-season break and put City Country in that period when you're having the Pacific Island tests and when you're having State of Origin Game 2, because I actually think that's is also a good experience for some of the younger fringe players. And with a World Cup year as well, or in a World Cup cycle, it's a good experience for those players who may not play for Australia and New Zealand, who may play for one of the minor nations. Some experience where you're taken away from the club dynamic and you're put into a training camp and a team camp that is with players you wouldn't know or players you don't play with. And that kind of dynamic probably very, very good for developing those players and giving those players that kind of experience, which then they can take back to their club side and say, look, I've experienced an Origin camp or a rep camp for the first time. I learnt some new things, that kind of thing. So it's good for player development, for one. And the crowd numbers were always really, really good. And I always felt the decision by the then CEO of the NRL, Todd Greenburg, was short-sighted. And I said that at the time, and I still say that now. And while when the NRL does take regular season games on the road to places like Dubbo and Mudgee and Wagga Wagga and even the bigger cities like Perth, it's brilliant and the crowd numbers are really, really good. I do think the NRL has missed a trick here and lost a little bit, because you do hear people talk about tradition of the sport and when we have those like milestone games, or when former great players pass away or players retire, there's always this big thing on milestones and tradition. And I'm one of those guys who, while I'm a younger fan and an overseas fan as well, I do think that the sport's losing something, like the Challenge Cup being played on the same weekend as, some of the biggest, what we call football, what you call soccer in Australia, meant the crowd number wasn't great. And I understand you want to keep that tradition, but at the same time, you've got to keep that balance. I think the NRL's got that balance wrong. I think City Country does still have a place in the game. It's one of the reasons why I love the sport. As a young kid growing up watching the City Country match, firstly when it did still mean something in the early 90s, and then as the NRL establishes itself and it loses its importance, it's still a great one-off game. It's great for those younger players and those veteran players who are no longer Origin players to still put on a show for the fans in the rural, or regional locations in New South Wales. And there's ways you can tinker the format, so you can have like a Queensland version as well, or a Queensland, like Brisbane, Sydney City team versus a Queensland, New South Wales country team. There are various ways, as I argued a few years ago, where you can tinker the format to still have like a city country playoff kind of thing, or a 4-team competition while Origin is on, because I'm not a massive fan of the bye weeks during Origin and how it actually impacts some teams more than others. So one team will put out like a pretty much full lineup, not a lot of Origin players. Another team is heavily decimated, so you actually get that unnatural scoreline, which you otherwise wouldn't have. I think sometimes just giving those players that 2-3 week break in that period in the season and tinkering the season schedule a little bit. You could have like a Queensland City and a Queensland country and a New South Wales City and a New South Wales country team. You can tinker with that format. It's a brilliant idea. It could be a good moneymaker, because if you look at Peter V'Landys and Andrew Abdo, they do think outside the box a lot. So my question to the viewers, especially the Australian viewers, is should they bring back City Country? Please place your comments in the section below. If you like or are interested in this kind of debate, please hit the like, subscribe, and those kind of buttons. And I'll obviously have some more content for you very, very soon. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye for now.